Hello and welcome back. We are developing the Downbelow RPG, and I am Ian.
I'm Steve.
And today we're going to talk about failing.
This is something we could spend a long time talking about, so we're going to try to limit ourselves to approximately 10 minutes. We're going to cover basically three things. We're going to cover overall tension level in a scene and what failure means. We're going to cover how failure depletes beneficial resources, and we're also going to touch briefly on the flip side of that, how success can deplete harmful resources as well.
Because we mentioned resource tracks very briefly at the end of the last discussion, and we should explain them a little more.
So, actually, let's explain them really quickly. Resource tracks are a convenience for the GM's back end. They don't always have a specific tangible number, but sometimes they do. They measure such things as what are the current stakes in a scene. If it is a low-intensity scene where stakes are relatively minor, a bit of bad publicity, a bit of smeared name, possibly a sprained ankle, or has this escalated to something severe or very severe.
Examples of these resource tracks could be time remaining until the police find you, or how much patience this NPC has for your crap.
Let's see. Furthermore, there's other resource tracks, such as the evil Mr. Chu's gun running budget. This is a negative thing. Successes could deplete this. Or your boss, Mr. Chu's gun running budget. This is a positive thing. Failures could deplete that. In either case, when they run out, bad things can happen.
So let's talk about failures and the different levels at which they can make your good things disappear. The basic level of failure is immediate consequences don't happen, but at the end of the scene, if the scene ends because you've gotten the number of failures that the GM decided this scene will end at this number of regular failures, then something bad happens, and that something bad probably means that something good goes away.
Basic failures do not generally affect the tension track at all. The basic failure says that, the stakes remain about as expected for the situation. They neither increase nor decrease. The expected happens. Example of this is in Star Wars. When the Millennium Falcon is first leaving Hoth, a failure on the piloting roll, enough failures to get caught by the Imperials would mean our crew is caught by the Imperials. Exactly as expected.
And exactly as happened. They were caught by Imperial fighters and pursued by Imperial warships.
Yep.
However, if a particularly bad failure had happened, they might have ended up caught by an Imperial tractor beam and not only chased in the Falcon, but a completely different scene than actually happened.
Alternately, here's another example. After several bad failures, the Millennium Falcon with a crippled hyperdrive has ended up in the asteroid belt. In that asteroid belt, they take refuge in a cave. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Because the tension level has risen, failures at this point indicate that the cave is actually the belly of a giant slug and is about to eat and digest the starship that our intrepid heroes thought was safe.
So, failures that make the scene worse can mean that's no moon, this is no cave, that sort of thing. In the Downbelow context, it's a little bit less space fantasy and a little bit more that is a gun in his pocket and he's not happy to see you.
Alternately, failures... Here's one thing that you should be sparing about. When increasing the tension level due to failures, don't just throw things in from left field. Try to make sure it works. Increased tension level might in fact mean that the cops have arrived on scene when they were not expected. What it probably does not mean is that the cops have magically teleported 50 miles to a deserted offshore rock to arrest you for littering. That probably would not happen, no matter how high the tension got.
And I'm confident in saying that 70 to 80% of the time, it's going to be the player's choice of actions that's going to increase the tension level from what you, the GM, planned. Because as GM, you probably had an idea of, okay, if things go the way that it looks like they're going to go, this is what's going to be on the table. And then the players do something that makes it more dangerous or makes it dangerous to a different element that you hadn't expected.
So, before we move on to talking about specific resource tracks, let's recap and put in and rephrase tension levels. All scenes always start at a tension level. That tension level is low, medium, or high. Low tension levels mean that there are no additional bad consequences for basic failures, period.
Medium tension level means that the scene is going to result, if it ends in failure, in something really bad being lost, not just a long-term, there is something bad down the road. It means you're actually going to have to deal with this.
Medium tension level can also mean that any failure could carry with it long-term consequences, even if it's just a basic failure.
High tension level means that any individual failure might give you immediate, you got hurt or lost something consequences, in addition to the scene ending in failure could be disastrous.
Note, there is no built-in very high tension level. Very high tension level is what happens when you have a high tension level and someone gets a highly bad failure.
This is the sort of thing where player characters can die or be crippled and otherwise possibly be removed from the story.
So, to recap, again, there's no strict numerical versions of this. This is kind of a gut feeling thing. A finalized version of the game might actually have numerical tracks and triggers for that. But for now, we're leaving that largely to narrative guidelines and GM and player gut feeling and negotiation.
So, the next thing we were going to talk about, what was it?
The next thing we're going to talk about is NPC resource tracks.
So, I think we talked about that.
We kind of did, but let's recap that really quickly. Every major player that is not represented by the PCs has the opportunity to have certain levels of resource tracks. We've talked about this previously. They can be bad or good. Good things are stuff like patience for the players, willingness to help the players. Bad things are things like resources they can throw against the players, pull they have with the players' enemies, etc.
We mentioned that successes, instead of modeling it as you need this many to get through a scene, you can model it as successes can deplete the bad resources or add to the good resources.
And finally, the last use of these is something you can use for alternate scene resolutions. We don't necessarily mean ending the scene early, although sometimes it can mean that. We mean various ways to change the track of a scene. Let's say there is a negative track called the Gunrunner's Budget for Bounty Hunters. If that is depleted to 0 at the end of the scene, the Gunrunner can no longer hire bounty hunters to come after the player characters. So whether the scene ends in a good or a bad way, future scenes will be influenced by the fact that this complication is now off the table. This could be represented in a couple of ways. It could lower the intensity level of future scenes, or it could simply change the outcome and have certain scenes that were scripted with the aforementioned bounty hunters, etc., to be removed from the plot and replaced with new ones.
So the last thing I'd like to cover in our talking about resources and failure is when failure means the end.
Right.
So character death is something that is handled in various different ways in many different RPGs, and this is how we handle it in Downbelow. It is usually off the table. Most choices of success or failure should not involve player character elimination.
In fact, nothing should ever arbitrarily involve player character elimination. Gone is the fact of the random goblin scored a crit and your character's story is over before it began.
That is not the kind of game this is. That's not to say it's not a legitimate form of entertainment, it's just not what we're doing here.
Exactly.
To be in that kind of situation, we mentioned tension levels rising. It should be something where you have to begin a scene that you got into because of failure, and you make a choice that leads to things becoming potentially lethal, and then you choose, or whether by having successes but choosing not to use them, or by having chosen to use up all your successes before you got to this point, you choose that you fail in a situation where you know that on the table failure means death.
There's also one final possibility where you might, you might even be making a greater contribution to the story if you're in a standoff and your opponent has a gun pulled on you and you choose to fail. Being shot is often fatal. You know this. You're failing at convincing him to put the gun away. This probably means that you are adding to someone else's successes, but in this case it's narratively appropriate for the character to die. The character made the choice. The character is gone.
But once again, it is entirely the negotiation between player and GM, because if it is not appropriate in the player and GM's opinion, then you get shot and go to the hospital instead of getting shot and die.
There's a lot of other interactions we could model, but we're out of time for today. So, until next time, this has been Down Below.
And I'm Ian.
I'm Steve.
And thank you for watching.